I have argued elsewhere that successful mobilization of Americans for the enormous changes that must come to our welfare state programs and to national economic policy must begin with a similar expression of trust in and affection for our fellow citizens. I have met very few people who, presented with the arithmetic facts of our indebtedness, would acknowledge that, yes, sure, they are quite comfortable spending borrowed money on themselves at the expense of their children. Now, starting from a negative presumption is often self-defeating, and that's reason enough to avoid the practice. But let's just state it positively. If we would summon the best from Americans, we must assume the best about them. If we don't believe in Americans, who will? 2 weeks ago, for the 125th and presumably final time, I stayed overnight in a Hoosier home. What began as an exercise in thrift, cheapness, my wife would say, by a no-name, first-time political candidate, became a practice I continued throughout 9.5 years pursuing and holding elective office. Never a hotel, always a home. The taxpayer and contributors' money saved was very secondary to the new friends made and the insights gathered from these encounters with a myriad of typical citizens, virtually none of them politically active or previously known to me. At family breakfast on a dairy farm near the tiny town of Stroh, I heard the story of Jody and Carlos. Since 900 dairy cattle are more than Todd, his brothers, and his young sons can handle alone, he has a few hired hands. Jody, a local fellow in his mid-30s, had approached Todd at church in search of work and was brought on board. After a few weeks of tardiness, carelessness, and sometimes just plain laziness, Todd let him go. Days later, Jody came around asking for his job back. Told that, sorry, 3 strikes is 3 strikes, he left without appeal or complaint. Only later did an attorney friend clue Todd in that undoubtedly his former employee's conduct, from the initial application through purposely poor performance, through the motions, second job search, was all calculated to qualify him for unemployment insurance. It's the kind of story I've heard depressingly often, especially in the recent recession and non-recovery. When I asked who Todd's best employee was, he told me about Carlos, about 25 years old, with apparently authentic immigration papers. Carlos hails from Mexico. Individually, Todd told me, he is a tireless, self-starting worker who keeps track of every hour and every penny. And when the farm has an opening, Carlos is likely to show up with a promising candidate for whom he evinces a sense of responsibility. I bring you only good people, Mr. Todd. With savings from his earnings, Carlos has already bought a small ranch. He intends to raise his own cattle there as soon as his savings suffice. The American dream is alive and well in Stroh, if sometimes stronger in those for whom it is newest. As Ronald Reagan reminded us so often, the dream is not solely American. It only bears that label because it first burst forth here. And it was here that government designed to enable and encourage individual freedom and fulfillment was first devised. My personal conviction, based on thousands of interactions with the people of a diverse and, I believe, reasonably typical American state, is that the dream and the will to pursue it are still dominant in the character of our countrymen. There are far more Carloses than Jodys, and most of them are native-born. If history does reveal that this one nation did, in fact, exhaust its store of virtue, then liberty will still prevail elsewhere, where it is not yet taken for granted and where its fruits have yet to be harvested. Unlikely and unwelcome as the thought is, perhaps freedom's future will prove more promising in lands other than this, its birthplace. But like those safe haven investors who see the weakness of the U.S. economy but cannot find a better place to invest, my money's still on us for all our faults. Freedom has been down for the mandatory 8 count before and gotten off the mat to rally. In his preface to the 1987 edition, Chambers' fervent admirer Bob Novak lamented, quote, the apogee of Reaganism, and said that Reagan would be leaving office with his anti-communist doctrine, quote, in tatters and the initiative in the hands of the Kremlin. 29 months later, the winning side Chambers was sure he had deserted died. Over the next few years, and maybe just months, the debts we have accumulated and that this presidency has doubled will begin to assert themselves. We must hope and work to see that an easily imaginable panic and economic ruin does not result. But at best, economic circumstances will remain difficult. Even if reserve currency status and the absence of alternatives continues to protect us a while longer, the Obamacare legislation will take effect. Its implementation will likely be a nightmare of missed deadlines, public confusion, inconsistent exceptions, and dashed expectations. Every claim made for the bill will be shown to have been false. Healthcare costs will go up, not down. Government spending and debt will go up, not down. The economy will be injured, not benefited. People by the millions will in fact lose the health insurance they have and like. Indeed, these calamities are already evident. These failures, abetted by the natural tendency of Americans to swing the pendulum every so often, set the stage for a powerful restoration of an architecture of liberty. Freedom's friends must be ready, not just with cerebral prescriptions for better policy, but with a moral argument that affirms the God-given dignity of each of us, that says, yes, you can, to everyone, including, and in fact especially, the famous 47%. And with a vocabulary that invites and welcomes, with the forgiving grace Whittaker Chambers extended Alger Hiss, every American to become a part of our national reconstruction. That places at the dead center of our concern the young, the poor, the yet-to-haves, the millions of Carloses, active or latent, who remain the large majority in our nation. In 1980, a Wyoming single mother mystified a New York Times reporter by stating that, yes, absolutely, she supported candidate Reagan's proposed income tax cuts. But why, the reporter spluttered, you don't make enough money to pay income taxes? The woman's reply was, one day I will. Freedom's friends must shape their words and actions when the opportunity for action arrives in ways that say emphatically, yes, you can, and one day you will. Were Whittaker Chambers with us tonight, he might well dismiss me, politely I'm sure, as naive or wishful or both. He might celebrate that he was so wrong about which side would win the Cold War, but he might tell me that the fundamentals had not changed, that Western civilization was still terminally ill. I would have nothing conclusive to offer in response except some anecdotal observations from my last 10 years of field research, and the kind of faith that sustained him through his time of trial and agony. I suppose I could just tell him, credo quia impossibile. Thank you for the privilege of this podium.